All right, let's jump right into this explainer and take a close look at the ultimate global brand. When you think about America's greatest exports, your mind probably goes straight to Microsoft or General Electric, maybe even Harvard. But actually, the most recognizable brand on the entire planet isn't a massive tech company or an Ivy League school. It is, without a doubt, the American dollar. It's this universal symbol of making it big, a total obsession, and literally the absolute engine of the global economy. But how exactly did it get this powerful?
Well, this quote brilliantly illustrates the psychological hold this currency has on the world. You can travel pretty much anywhere, hand someone a $20 bill, and they instantly recognize its value. Think about this for a second. Whenever you see anti-American protests on the news, you might see protesters smashing a McDonald's window or burning a flag. But you will never, ever see anyone burning an American dollar. It represents this ironclad promise of value that just completely transcends borders and politics. But as you'll see, the dollar wasn't always this untouchable juggernaut.
Which brings us to Section 1, from chaos to centralization.
Okay, so to really understand the dollar today, we have to look back at the incredibly messy, totally decentralized origins of the country's monetary system before it became the powerhouse we know today. And what's actually super surprising is that the word dollar itself, it doesn't even start in America. It actually comes from 15th century Central Europe. There was this heavy silver mining in a place called Joachimsthal, and the coins minted there were called Joachimsthalers. Over time, people just naturally shortened it to thaler, which eventually morphed into the word dollar. Oh, and that iconic dollar sign we all know and love? It very likely comes from the Spanish-American dollar, which featured a curve snaking around two vertical lines that represented the Pillars of Hercules.
Now, when the young United States was first forming, they had to figure out how to manage this new money, and it sparked a massive clash of ideas. On one side, you had Alexander Hamilton, whose face you'll find on the $10 bill today. He wanted a centralized federal bank. He firmly believed it was the absolute only way to stabilize debt and build real industry. But on the flip side was Thomas Jefferson, the guy on the $2 bill. Jefferson had a totally different vibe. He envisioned this decentralized agrarian nation, where money was distributed much more equally among common men rather than being controlled by a central elite in a big city.
So Jefferson's decentralized vision actually won out early on. But let me tell you, the results were complete and utter chaos. Because there was no central bank issuing a single currency, everyone just started printing their own money. Private banks, railroad companies, hotels, even local corner stores started printing their own dollars. By 1860, there were literally 10,000 different kinds of dollars floating around in circulation. Can you even imagine going to a modern grocery store and arguing with the cashier over whether the note you brought from a random bank in Tennessee is worth $1 or 50 cents? It was completely preposterous. And as you might guess, it was an absolute paradise for counterfeiters, who would literally just invent fictional banks out of thin air and print money for them.
Moving on to Section 2, conquering the world.
That Wild West era simply couldn't last forever. The real moment of truth arrived with the American Civil War, which forced the government to fundamentally change how it handled money. To fund the war effort, Abraham Lincoln standardized the currency, creating the famous greenback, called that because the green ink on the back was just way too hard to counterfeit. Now, let's fast forward a bit to the end of World War II in 1944. The global economy was totally devastated, but the U.S. economy, it was booming. At the Bretton Woods Conference, the global financial system was essentially rebuilt entirely around the dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and basically every other major currency was pegged right to the dollar. In the 1950s, the U.S. just showered Europe in dollars through the Marshall Plan to help them rebuild. And by the 1960s, the U.S. was really using this exorbitant privilege to run huge deficits. They were essentially acting as the world's personal money printer to buy up assets globally and fund their military efforts.
Which leads right into Section 3, the roller coaster ride.
But here's the thing. Printing money relentlessly comes with a serious cost. The crucial point here is how this golden era fractured when countries finally started calling America's bluff. By the mid-1960s, the U.S. had printed so many dollars that it literally only had enough physical gold to cover about 20% of them. While countries like France and Germany noticed this math wasn't adding up, and they started demanding their actual gold back in exchange for their dollars. U.S. gold reserves were just plummeting. In response to all these European complaints, the U.S. took an incredibly aggressive, arm-twisting stance. U.S. Treasury Secretary John Connally famously told a delegation of Europeans, "The dollar is our currency, but your problem." They were going to manage it for America's best interest, and everyone else, they just had to deal with the fallout.
The absolute breaking point hit on August 15, 1971.
President Nixon shocked the entire world by suddenly suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Overnight, the whole Bretton Woods system was just dead. The dollar became a floating currency, meaning its value changed daily based purely on supply and demand. And wow, did this send the global economy on a wild roller coaster ride. During the late 70s, inflation soared to a terrifying 15%. To kill it, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker cranked interest rates up past 20%, which sent the dollar's value absolutely to the moon. It got so expensive that by 1985, the major powers had to sit down and sign the Plaza Accord just to artificially weaken it again.
And just to give you an idea of how painful those 20% interest rates actually were under Volcker, it absolutely decimated the housing market. Home builders were so furious that they protested by literally sawing up 2x4 blocks of wood and mailing them directly to Volcker's office at the Federal Reserve. They were basically saying, "We can't use these to build houses anymore, so you take them." People would literally stop him in the street and blame him for their families losing their jobs. It was brutal for sure. But it did finally break the back of that rampant inflation.
Next up is Section 4, Anatomy of the Dollar.
So you might be wondering, who exactly is making these massive, world-altering decisions today? Well, we really need to look under the hood at the physical and institutional structure of this currency. Understanding what the money supply actually looks like right now is absolutely key. The U.S. Federal Reserve, which manages all this, is pretty unique. It's a privately owned but federally supervised central bank. And when we look at the actual money they manage, a whopping 90% of it is entirely digital, literally just numbers in a computer system. Only 10% exists as physical banknotes. But here's a really fascinating fact. That 10% is actually double the physical rate of the British pound or the euro. Why? Purely for domestic reasons. You see, roughly 15% of American households are unbanked and rely entirely on hard cash to survive.
Because of this heavy reliance on cash, and this is despite the massive rise of credit cards and Apple Pay, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing is running nonstop. Every single day, they produce 22 tons of crisp, new bills. That's enough to equate to about $750 million in face value daily. Oh, and by the way, it's not actually paper. It's a secret, highly durable fabric formulation specifically designed to last for years and years in your wallet.
Now, what about the actual artwork printed on that fabric? You know, it has sparked endless, wild conspiracy theories over the years. But let's quickly decode it together. The 33 eagle feathers and that creepy, unfinished pyramid? Actually, scratch the sinister Masonic plot idea. They aren't signs of some secret society trying to take over the world. Only a few of the founding fathers were even Freemasons. Rather, the design reflects shared 18th century enlightened values, mixed with some Christian symbolism and a little bit of Egyptology. The pyramid simply represents durability. It's meant to last thousands of years. The all-seeing eye? That represents divine watchfulness over the new nation. As for the famous phrase, "In God we trust," that was actually requested by a Pennsylvania minister during the bloody trauma of the Civil War. It appeared on coins first, and surprisingly was only added to paper money much later in 1957.
But here is where the story gets incredibly global. Of the roughly $777 billion in physical circulation today, a staggering 70%, that's over $512 billion, exists entirely outside the borders of the United States. Foreigners hold the vast majority of physical U.S. currency as a kind of ultimate emergency fund, a completely safe store of value when their own local economies or currencies become unstable.
Let's move to Section 5, the invisible digital empire.
So as important as it is, all that physical cash is just a tiny, tiny fraction of the whole picture. We have to look at where the real, modern financial power sits today. The real dollar, the one that wields total global influence, is entirely electronic. We're talking about an absolutely staggering $2 to $3 trillion being bought and sold every single day in the foreign exchange market. That is happening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, moving globally in mere fractions of a second.
And how exactly is this massive market driven? Well, first, it's about interest rates. Capital simply flows to whichever country is offering the highest return. Period. Second, thanks to the internet, every single human trader and algorithmic machine is reacting to the exact same global news releases instantly. But third, and this is perhaps the most surprising part, the short-term value is driven almost entirely by human emotion. If the market is feeling happy or optimistic, traders sell their safe dollars to go buy riskier assets. But if they feel scared, they flood right back to the dollar for safety. It is totally irrational in the short term. And honestly, here's the craziest takeaway from all of this. This market has grown so massively huge that the US government itself can no longer control the value of its own currency through direct intervention. The machines and the global markets are entirely in the driver's seat now.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 6, Threats to the Throne.
All of this naturally begs the question, how long can this possibly last? Is the dollar's century-long dominance finally facing real existential competition? Well, if you look at who actually holds the U.S. debt, it's largely foreign states. China is first, followed closely by the Gulf oil monarchies, and then Japan. That Middle Eastern connection is especially important to understand. Back in 1945, President FDR and King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia struck a massive deal. The U.S. would protect the Arabian Peninsula militarily, and in exchange, Middle Eastern oil would be priced exclusively in U.S. dollars. Today, however, as the dollar's value fluctuates so wildly, some of these Gulf states are really beginning to question if they should keep their local currencies pegged to the dollar or maybe start looking elsewhere.
And what about the euro? You know, when it was first created, so many people thought it would easily dethrone the dollar. Mathematically and economically speaking, the euro absolutely has the potential to become the primary world reserve currency. But experts note it lacks one crucial, hard-to-quantify ingredient: the aggressive global ambition of the United States. As one of our sources pointed out, the European Union just doesn't have the militant or imperialistic drive to govern global finance. The euro wasn't really built to dominate the world. It was simply built to unify Europe.
So what should you really take away from this explainer? Well, rather than a sudden, catastrophic collapse of the dollar, the global financial system is much more likely evolving into regional blocks. Over time, we might start to see a distinctly North American bloc, a Chinese bloc, an Indian bloc, and a European bloc. The dollar is still going to be incredibly important, no doubt about it, but its absolute, unquestioned rule will simply become a little less exceptional.
I want to leave you with this final, genuinely provocative thought from the legendary former Fed Chairman Paul Volcker. When he was asked if a single world currency would ever step up to fully dethrone the US dollar and completely unify global finance, he made two very interesting predictions. First, he said the world would ultimately be much, much better off with a single world currency. But his second statement, he said, it's not going to happen in my lifetime, and I'm not even sure it's going to happen in yours. So it looks like dollar dominance is here to stay for a while. It's complex, it's highly controversial, and it is fundamentally woven into the very fabric of our modern world. Thanks so much for diving into this explainer with me, and keep questioning what's really in your wallet.